Hi, everybody, and welcome to the live stream. Today, the world finally got a confession from Alex Murdaugh. Not to the murders, though. It was to the side of the road incident. But there really was no triumph to it. There was no gotcha. It was frankly very sad. It was watching the disintegration of a human being due to drug use. But then we have to ask, was it real? And did it have anything to do with the murders? We're going to talk about all of that today. We're also going to talk about whether Alex killed the defense's ability to blame Cousin Eddie or the Cowboys and the Sandhill gang. So please make the YouTube algorithm happy by hitting that thumbs up button, and we'll get started. If you aren't familiar with the case, Alex Murdaugh is a now disbarred attorney who was one of the finest attorneys in the Low Country of South Carolina. He's now been accused of 99 financial crimes, many of which we've heard about in this case, which is only about whether or not he murdered his wife and son. He's also accused of that. Today, though, was all about the side of the road incident. Now, that's been in and out more times than you can imagine. It started before trial with pretrial motions, and it was out. And then when the sister of Maggie Murdaugh, one of the murder victims, was testifying, it came in a little bit. And then the judge ruled it out again. And then the judge ruled it back in partially. And then this morning, the judge ruled it in, and it came all the way in, roaring in the entire thing. Now, what on earth, you may be asking, is the side of the road incident? What is that even about? What happened was that Alex Murdaugh claimed about 2 months after the murders, actually 3 months after the murders, that he was shot on the side of the road by a stranger. He said he stopped to change a flat tire. A stranger stopped to help and shot him in the head. He called 911, and he even worked with a sketch artist to come up with a sketch for this person who supposedly shot him. Then lots of things happened, among some of which were, for example, that the vehicle he was driving had run flat tires. So why was he stopped on the side of the road to change a tire in the first place? After a time, Alex Murdaugh admitted from detox, saying he had a drug problem, and he had hired his cousin, the person called Cousin Eddie Smith, to kill him so he could collect insurance. That he, obviously, being dead, wouldn't collect the insurance, but it would go to his son, Buster, who was still living, the only member of his immediate family there still living, because his wife and other son were killed. His mother was still living. Alex Murdaugh's claim was, this was my attempt to commit suicide. I was trying to kill myself and make sure that Buster could get all of this money. Now, the defense, here's how it all came in. The defense questioned the lead investigator, said, did you find out Alex was, none of this was in, mind you, none of this side of the road thing was in. They said, did you find out Alex was paying Cousin Eddie Smith $50,000 a week for drugs and buying from the Sandhill gang, which was an affiliate of the Cowboys gang? And the answer was yes. The lead investigator did find that. And that Eddie owed the gangs a lot of money. And apparently the answer to that also was yes, because the lead investigator said, instead of answering directly, he said the gangs weren't worried because it was Murdaugh. There's all the money they could possibly need, so they aren't worried about it. Then the defense attorney said, did you hear Eddie Smith was skimming money and making the gangs think that Alex was shorting them? And it came in. I am not convinced that it came in, that it should have come in, but the judge's decision was that this was something that had been where the defense had opened the door, and the defense had done that. Now, he ruled that more than once, but he ruled it yesterday. He said, you defense opened the door with this questioning. Jim Griffin, the defense attorney, then got up this morning and said, well, you know, ironically, I never had the luxury of YouTube before, but I went back through my exact argument that I made. I listened back to myself, and I didn't ask any questions about the roadside shooting or lying to police. It was all about stealing from clients to support drug addiction, which is already in evidence. And then the judge said, look, initially I ruled it out, but I think it has to come in now because of what you elicited about Eddie Smith. I'm not convinced of that. I'm not sure that he ruled correctly, but it was a disaster, and it's hard even to know whose disaster it is. It was a disaster, especially, I think, when only part of it came in, because the jury could easily be confused. When the judge let in just a little bit through Marion Proctor, the sister of Maggie Murdaugh, it just was very confusing. The jury easily could have thought that this was proof that there was a gang shooting up the Murdaughs, and here was more evidence of it. It really was just unclear, and the judge truthfully did have to correct that problem. It helps the defense in some ways that this comes in. One is they have a clear appeal ground. The defense asked very limited questions and may never have opened the door. And their argument on appeal is going to be that they mentioned Eddie Smith for limited purposes and they didn't open the door to all of this. The second thing is that the defense needed to talk about Eddie Smith, needed to talk about the drug gangs and that potential connection. It might be worth the trade for them. It's hard to know, but it also clearly helps the prosecution in several ways, which is why the prosecution wanted this evidence in. The prosecution wants to show that Alex Murdaugh is a liar, that he's manipulative, and that he's willing to lie to law enforcement. And this shows all of those things. So we'll get into it and talk about it. First, I want to talk about the first witness up, Dr. Kenneth Lee Kinsey, who is a chief deputy from Orangeburg, teaches classes and works for SLED, had 30 years of crime scene investigation and had processed more than 800 death scenes. He was an ideal expert witness for the prosecution because he was unflappable, he was confident, he wasn't defensive, and his job was to reconstruct what had happened. Now, I heard some critique of the cross-examination. I'll get into that. I think that critique was unfair. I think this expert did what he was supposed to do for the prosecution, and the defense made the points they needed to make. So we'll talk about it. Paul was the son who was murdered on June 7th, 2021. And Paul was shot, according to this witness, while he was standing in the middle of the feed room at the hunting lodge, not at the house, but in the feed room near the kennels. And the pellets went through the back window on this first shot. Paul's hands were not raised, according to this witness. And there was a partial foot impression, which the witness attributed to Paul walking through his own blood. Now, the breech of the gun that shot him, according to this witness, was inside the feed room, was at the door, but inside the feed room. He said he couldn't tell where the shooter was. It depended on the length of the gun. But there were expended shells behind the door that opened inward into the feed room. So that was sort of the setting. He also said that Paul moved to the door after he was shot the first time. And the witness could tell that, and that he wasn't moving fast because clear round droplets of blood were on the floor, meaning they were dripping straight down. The second shot to Paul, and there was a second one, meant immediate death, he said. The body went straight to the ground. All movement was ceased. And when he landed, was partway out the door by the time of the second shot. He was and according to this witness, at the time he was shot, he must have been in the door frame with his head and shoulder just outside the door frame, and he was dipping his left shoulder because it had been injured from the first shot. Now, there were some important points that he made. The first was that there was no biological material at the back of the room. He used that to sort of reconstruct where the shooter would have been, and that there was blood on the upper part of the door, meaning that Paul was shot from below, not from above, and that it wasn't suicide because he did not think that Paul could have shot himself at that angle. And I had to wonder if if this was a suicide, well, where was the gun? It seems like he would have a difficult time getting rid of it before he was found, since he died immediately after the second shot. The shooter would have had blood on him. That's what the witness testified. That's important and actually not favorable for the state, since Alex Murdaugh did not have blood on him when he was found. There's been a lot of discussion about what clothes he was wearing, whether he changed. But at this stage, the only clothes that are in evidence did not have blood on them. There was also, according to this witness, no evidence that the shooter and Paul struggled. Oh, and so let me switch to Maggie, and I'll talk about what happened. I see Jay Westside's question, and I'll get to that. I also want to give a special shout out to DJ Holiday for his super chat yesterday, which I somehow missed. So my apologies and thank you. And while I'm thinking about it, please be sure to like the video and subscribe. We're covering this case every night until the end. So come back for more. So Jay Westside, don't you think the defense did this on purpose? And I'll get to that. And Jay Westside is saying, they may have intended, and he's talking about the side of the road incident. Did they intend to do that on purpose? We'll talk about that. I don't think so, but it really is ambiguous about whether it helped or hurt the defense. There is a lot of question about that. We'll talk about my impressions of the tape they played of Alex Murdaugh's confession, and I think that will go to answer Jay Westside's question some. So now with Maggie was shot with a completely different gun, not even the same type of gun that killed Paul. That's one of the reasons the defense says there had to have been two shooters, not just one shooter. And the sort of mechanics that it would take for one person to shoot somebody a couple of times, switch guns, run around, shoot somebody else 5 times from 2 different directions, that just seems improbable. Alex Murdaugh could not have murdered both of these people by himself. So with Maggie, this witness said, well, the shots to her could have come from the direction of the feed room. So Paul gets killed. That person then kills Maggie, who's apparently coming toward the feed room. That's what the picture graph looked like to me. That there were 3 non-fatal wounds and then 2 fatal wounds for Maggie. He figured she was bent over and in pain. And one shot that was fatal was to the abdomen, the side of the face, the brain. The other was down into her head and came second. They were fired in quick succession, he said. The first fatal wound, he figured she fell to the ground, and the second one was into the crown of her head while she was lying flat on the ground. We know that the defense has a different theory. We don't know for sure what they think, but because there's been reference to what the defense has called a footprint on the back of Maggie's leg, my guess is that the defense is going to say this was more of an execution, that somebody stood above her and shot down at her. That is not what the prosecution thinks. And the prosecution doesn't even think that what's on the back of her leg is a footprint. We got into more issues with problems for evidence collection by SLED, that there weren't sufficient photographs of either the area on the back of Maggie's leg or the tire of an ATV that's near her, because it's that tire that the prosecution says caused the mark on the back of her leg. That, according to this witness, was an imprint most likely of the tire from the ATV near her, that it ran over the back of her leg. Why it was still sitting there, if it had run over her, wasn't clear. But that's the prosecution argument. The witness had to say the pictures were not clear enough for him to definitively say, because there was only one of the back of the leg and of the tires, there was not enough for him to say for sure that tire created this imprint. And ironically, the woman who did the autopsy did not note any findings of bruising or mud or anything on the back of Maggie's leg. It was just apparent from the photograph that there was something there. He also offered up a defense of one of the points that's been made repeatedly by the defense, that SLED came in and didn't even swab the drains of the house. They want to say that Alex Murdaugh washed blood off, but they didn't check for any blood. And the defense is basically saying that's kind of unfair if you don't bother to check. And then you say, oh, but if had we checked, it would have shown that he washed off. So that's a constant critique by the defense, that the investigation was not thorough enough to even enable them to defend Alex Murdaugh. Then on cross-examination, I thought it was well done. I saw a critique of this saying that the defense wasn't able to make any points with him. I felt like that's not what you normally do with an expert witness, because the expert witness is never going to crumble on the stand and just say, oh, you're right. I completely changed my mind. I wish I had been an expert for you. That side is paying the person to be an expert witness, paying the person to come and talk about this case. So that's what they're going to do, and that's what they're going to say. So I thought within the constraints of the fact that the prosecution used him as an expert and that he worked for SLED, I thought that this was a well done cross. Here's what he said. He said that he recommends more photographs than were actually taken. He also insisted that Paul's showed you about the photographs for where he says agrees with the woman, Dr. Reamer, who did the autopsy, that the second shot came up through the shoulder into the jawbone and out the back of the head. The argument was that this particular shot, or what he testified to, was that this particular shot had to have come at a 135-degree angle, or, as Dick Harpootlian pointed out, 45 degrees from the ground. So his argument was that this shot came up almost at an angle about like that and through into the shoulder. Dick Harpootlian had him demonstrate where the gun would have to be held. And it looked, and he went through exactly how tall Paul was, which bizarrely is something in dispute in the case. But the wound was at about 4 feet 7 inches. And so he was able to show that, exactly, at least approximately where the height was. And he showed when the witness put the gun at this spot, the butt of the gun was on the ground, and the rifle had to have been within 2 feet, or shotgun had to have been within 2 feet of Paul, which then would have left stippling, which wasn't present. Now, the defense says that the gunshot wound came in the opposite direction, that it came from here, down through here, and down through the shoulder, and that those are exit wounds. The defense is trying to show that what the prosecution said couldn't have happened, that there would have been stippling, and that besides, it's bizarre to hold your gun down on the ground and angle up like it's the person all crouched down. How does that even work? So that's what we'll hear. Why does it matter? You may wonder, what do we care? We don't know yet. There hasn't really been an explanation of that. We will get an explanation of that when the defense experts come. We'll find out why they think it's important that the gunshot came down. We do know, and are going to have to be waiting to find out, that there did appear to be blood at the top of the door. So how did that blood get there? The defense is obviously going to have to answer that question in order to be believable. But it did seem strange the way the gun was being held, and the fact that were missing stippling marks. Stippling is sort of it's a discoloration and affectation of the skin right around where the shot enters. If the shot comes within 3 feet of the person being shot, and Dr. Reamer said that's not the case, that it was further away because there was not any stippling there. We know it's going to be a big argument in the defense, but we don't fully get yet why it matters. The prosecution apparently hired somebody else to do the reconstruction before they called this particular witness in. And so that was sort of a hint from the defense that they think maybe the first witness would have gone on their side, or the prosecution didn't like them for some reason. Just a hint that there was some kind of problem. So I see Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for your super chat. The witness denied relying on any measurements of the shell casing locations that the sled agent had taken, which I thought was odd. Why would you not rely on those? But apparently the reason is that the defense is going to say those measurements are really important and show right where the shooter was standing, because they're going to say that, and I think they're going to suggest that the shooter may have been left-handed and Alex Murdaugh is right-handed. How do we know? We found that out today. During the middle of the confession, he just mentioned that he was right-handed. So that's just a guess. Since we don't have that information, I can't say that for sure. He also admitted he knew that shoulder wound was really big and it seemed bigger than it ought to be for the way that he says that the shot happened. The fun fact, Harpootlian, the defense attorney, had worked with him years before when Harpootlian was a prosecutor. So did that hurt him? I don't think so. I think it just, I think that's how it is. They all work together and that's a common thing. The judge did something I have never seen before next. He appointed a juror 828, as the foreman to preside over deliberations, to sit in the first seat and to communicate any questions from the jury and to fill out the verdict form. Now, of course, there's always a foreman. I just have never seen the judge appointed. I suppose that's the custom in South Carolina. The way I've typically experienced it is that there's an election among the jurors. They select the person they want to be the foreperson. So apparently that isn't the way it works here. So we now know juror 828 is the foreman. Now, we then went to the side of the road. We started with the witness, Ryan Kelly. He's a senior special agent for SLED. In September of 2021, he got a 911 call from Alex Murdaugh. I was struck by how calm Alex Murdaugh was compared to the 911 call about Maggie and Paul. And if you're interested in maybe hearing those two put together and I can talk through it, let me know. I think I might do a separate video on that if there's some interest in that. But it was pretty different. He said he was driving his wife Maggie's black Mercedes, that he had a flat tire and he pulled over and another motorist stopped, aged 30 to 40, in a newer model dark pickup truck, appeared really nice, and then shot him in the head. He described a person, close cropped hair, close cropped facial hair, and said he would recognize the person again. That happened over a series of interviews. May not have all happened in the initial 911 call. So the police arrived and all they found was a small puncture wound to the tire. Like, for example, they said maybe from a pocket knife. And ironically, even more strangely, it was a run flat tire. So there really didn't seem to be a need to pull over to the side of the road to change it. He talked to the police at the hospital in Savannah and again said the same thing, that he a pretty similar story, a few differences. Said he had lost his vision, dropped down to his knees. He didn't believe he had lost consciousness. And then they saw inside the black Mercedes sitting there was his assistant solicitor's badge, which is either ironic or he wanted people to know. It's hard to know which. So then they also found a gray utility knife, which is a folding knife. They showed it across the road from where the vehicle was found. They did not find any debris that could have created this damage to the tire. And they did DNA testing on the knife and found it matched Alex Murdaugh and cousin Eddie Smith, Curtis Eddie Smith. And Alex Murdaugh's will was sitting there in the Mercedes, bizarrely. So they even went to the trouble, law enforcement did, of working with Alex Murdaugh to draw a sketch of this person who supposedly shot him on the side of the road. But while he was in the hospital, Randy Murdaugh, Alex's brother, notified law enforcement that Alex was trying to make calls to an unknown number and trying to convince the staff to let him use their phones, and even offering staff money if they would just let him use their phones. So law enforcement checked and find he's calling Eddie Smith. They get footage. They find that from a church that was nearby where this shooting occurred, and they find that there's a blue truck that passes by and then back that has a right front gold quarter panel, and they see it driving one way and then driving back. They go to cousin Eddie Smith's house and find, lo and behold, the blue pickup truck with the gold quarter panel. They also find narcotics and a sales ledger with numbers and quantities of pills listed. They find transaction and deposit withdrawal receipts that they trace back to Alex Murdaugh. They say that Eddie lives in a modest house and drives a modest vehicle, but several $100,000 of deposits are going into his account. So there's some question about exactly what is his role. And this had happened before the murders and then after the murders, the Alex Murdaugh connection to the drugs. Then we had the confession. The confession was Alex Murdaugh in Atlanta at a rehab or detox center with his attorneys, Dick Carpootlian and Jim Griffin, and it was over the phone, audio only, with the SLED law enforcement investigators. And this is the story he told. He said the day of the shooting, he first met with Jim Griffin that day. This was September 5th. He met with Jim Griffin. Then he met with, who is now his attorney and was then as well. And then he met with his friend and attorney, Chris Wilson. Chris Wilson is the attorney who was still out $192,000 that Alex had taken when he was supposed to be it's a complicated story. I'll give you the shorter version as I possibly can. Chris Wilson was an attorney who did a case with Alex Murdaugh. Chris Wilson was supposed to give Alex Murdaugh or his firm $792,000, paid it directly to Alex. Alex apparently didn't notify the firm and was only able to reimburse Chris Wilson back $600,000. So Alex still owed Chris Wilson $192,000 and had embarrassed Chris Wilson. He told Chris Wilson that morning of the 5th that he had a long-standing OxyContin or opioid addiction for 18 to 20 years. He had been addicted. He had taken some at 4 a.m., but made a comment he'd given all he had to someone else. It was unclear what that meant, and was having some withdrawals by the time he met with Chris, or at least by the time of the shooting. The previous day, the 4th of September, it had come out that Alex was embezzling from his firm, and the firm had told Alex he had to resign from the firm that had his own father's name on the name of the firm. He also had said that he had, here's the actual quote. He said, "I was in a very bad place. I thought it would be better for me not to be here anymore, would make it easier on my family for me to be dead," which is truly pitiful. I want to say to D. Samlin, thank you for your super chat. I appreciate that. So he said he had a fair amount of life insurance. We've heard different numbers during the trial, 10, 12 million. And he decided that his son would be better off if he just ended his own life. So he said he called Curtis Eddie Smith. He said he was the primary person I purchased pills from for years. That some weeks he gave Eddie Smith as much as $40,000 to $60,000 a week for pills. That's $2.6 million a year if you take the middle range of that. Crazy. And he said he'd known him for years, that he called him that morning and asked him to meet Alex not too far from his mom's at a gas station. Said, "I want you to shoot me in the head." He said at first he was a little surprised, and then he said, okay, that Alex provided the gun, and that he made his own tire flat with a knife. He stood fairly close to his car. The guy, Eddie, shot him and missed, hit him in the back of the head, but missed anything vital. And he, in fact, was not killed. Now, I gather maybe Cousin Eddie is not actually Alex Murdaugh's cousin, which is what I had assumed, but the way he described it was that he met Cousin Eddie because somehow Eddie knew Alex Murdaugh's dad and had known Alex Murdaugh now for 10 to 12 years. Alex had represented him several times. And he said they talked frequently in the phone about getting pills, that he paid him money frequently. And he admitted right there to law enforcement that he had an account in his name, DBA Forge. Now, that is an admission related to some of the financial fraud. One of the reasons I think that's important is he's coming clean about things that are going to end up causing criminal trouble for him. So it's fairly clear that he's going to have criminal trouble for this, and yet he's being clean about it. I thought that was relevant to sort of evaluating what we think about his demeanor and how he acted during this confession. He said he lied about everything. He named 2 other people, by the way, he bought drugs from. Then he also said he lied to Randy, his brother, and a buster. He said, I told them the same lies that I told you. He said that to law enforcement. He didn't immediately volunteer that he had called Eddie Smith from the hospital, but when the prosecutor wanted to make a deal of that during the trial today, but he did tell law enforcement when they asked him about it, oh yeah, Randy tells me I did that, but I don't really remember what happened. This was the quote, or close as I could get. When withdrawals begin, you will do just about anything to make them quit, and I probably was calling him for that purpose. There was discussion from law enforcement about, well, Murdaugh's independently wealthy, and Harpootlian, the defense attorney, said, well, he may have been, but there's client money missing. And the investigator says, so the money came from ill-gotten gains? And Alex Murdaugh pipes up and says, the majority of it did. Again, another admission in the middle of this confession, but probably also personal funds. I was buying so many. The investigators, so we'll get into some questions about whether or not this is for real. Now, there was a piece related to the case and related to the alibi. They asked Alex Murdaugh, do you owe money to any drug dealers? And he said, no. And they said to him, so there's not a threat out there that we need to worry about for Buster. That's his other son, remember? And he said, no. He said, the money you were paying Curtis to get drugs from his dealer, you were paid in full, no outstanding debts. He said, no outstanding debts. And so then the defense lawyer pipes up in the middle of the interview and says, that's assuming that Curtis, cousin Eddie, passed all the money along. So the law enforcement then says, to the best of your knowledge, you don't owe anybody? And he said, no, sir. They said, so it was a suicide set up as a robbery homicide and was done in order for your son to get the life insurance policy. He said, I don't know about the robbery part, but everything else you just said is true. It was a very thorough confession to a lot of things, and not just the side of the road incident. He said the will was in his car, not because he was about to die, but because he met with some lawyers the day before. Now, Harpootlian made the point in the middle of the interview that this policy was 10 years old. So apparently Alex Murdaugh would not have been prevented from, or his family wouldn't have been prevented from collecting, even if there had been self-harm. But apparently Alex Murdaugh didn't realize that. And so he thought that this was the way he needed to do it. At least that's the argument he's making. He said he volunteered or answered voluntarily that he got that knife that he punctured the tire with from cousin Eddie when he handed the gun to cousin Eddie. That did make sense because that knife had both Alex Murdaugh's and Curtis Eddie's DNA on it. So that did make a lot of sense. And he was very truthful with them about the fact that he threw it to the other side of the road. And they said, so you put it right beside you? No, I threw it to the other side of the road, which is where they had said they found it. He denied specifically that Curtis had anything to do with Moselle. He also said there was no evidence that Curtis Edward Smith had anything to do with Moselle. Very specific. So the 3 things that I thought still remain somewhat in doubt, I will say overall, it was very persuasive. When you heard him, he just sounded very real and like he was very serious about what he was talking about. But there were 3 things that were questions in my mind. The first was, we know from Blanca Simpson, the housekeeper, that on September 4th, or maybe even the morning of September 5th, he called her and asked for his insurance cards prior to the incident on the side of the road. So was he not planning on dying? You kind of wonder. Secondly, Curtis was getting huge money. Why would he kill the goose that was laying the golden egg? You know, you have to wonder about that. That's Why would he do that? It seems so against his self-interest to kill Alex Murdaugh. And the one of the things law enforcement said was, I find it hard to believe that he did this for free. I mean, he charged you for everything else. He charged you for to be paid to shoot him. He charged you for this and that. So why do you say you didn't pay him at all? And I don't really believe you. So that was the third thing, was that he did say Curtis was not paid. He just voluntarily shot him, even though he was probably Eddie's best customer. So let's take a quick look at some of the questions. And I do want to say too, thank you, Mama Pink, for your super chat. I appreciate that. Let me see if I can get a question or two in. I want to go ahead and wrap up pretty quick, but if Eddie takes a stand but pleads the fifth, isn't that going to be catastrophic for the prosecution? If Eddie takes a stand, that will happen, right? I mean, he definitely will take the fifth. He has not yet been convicted of the crimes he's been charged of. We don't know how much he's admitted. Perhaps he's cut a deal, but almost certainly he would take the fifth. And unless he's cut a deal and there's some kind of assurance about what he's going to get, then probably he will take the fifth. Who's that going to hurt? I don't know. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be super interesting, but it's also going to be a mess. Given what we heard about the really strong statements from Alex Murdaugh about Cousin Eddie was not involved, it's going to be hard for the defense, I think, to point to Cousin Eddie. Alex undermines seriously the other potential defendants or the other potential murderers. Instead of saying, yeah, it could have been Cousin Eddie, it could have been the gangs who were maybe after me because Eddie was shorting them. He cast a lot of doubt on that. He didn't know he owed anybody money. He didn't think that Eddie was involved in any way. So all of those things make it seem more difficult for the defense to point the finger to anybody else. So we are covering this every night at 7 o'clock, and be sure to be here tomorrow night. We will be covering all the events tomorrow. I will see you. If you would, please like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you back tomorrow at 7.